He was born into a mansion full of light, yet he had never seen a single sunrise. The millionaire's son lived in silence and darkness until one humble little girl, with dirt on her hands and kindness in her heart, walked into his world. What happened next would defy every doctor, every doubt, and every law of reason. A hidden miracle born from the simplest touch of love. And before we go any further, let me wish you health and peace. Tell me, from which country and at what time are you watching this story? The mansion on the edge of Sonoma had once been a place full of laughter, but now it breathed only through the hum of machines and the soft ticking of a grandfather clock. Every morning, Thomas Cole walked down the marble hallway with a cup of black coffee that had long gone cold before he finished it. He liked the taste that way, bitter, simple, silent. Outside, the vineyard stretched endlessly, rows of vines sleeping under the mild Californian spring Sunday. Inside, everything felt asleep too. Thomas was a man who had forgotten what warmth felt like. The world saw him as a success, a widowed entrepreneur whose company built smart devices for human connection. But in truth, he lived disconnected from every heartbeat around him. His late wife's pictures still hung in the hallway, but he rarely looked at them. He didn't even open the curtains of his son's room anymore. That room had become a frozen world of machines, small monitors blinking beside a narrow bed where little Ethan lay motionless. The boy's chest rose and fell with mechanical rhythm, and a thin tube whispered air into him. Thomas told himself this was the best he could do. The doctors said therapy, sedation, stability. He repeated those words like prayers to keep the guilt at bay. Every afternoon, the nurse arrived and left without a word. The gardener trimmed the roses. The chef delivered bland dinners for one. The house kept breathing, but it never lived. Then one Tuesday morning, Maria Miller appeared at the front gate, holding her daughter's hand. She was in her late 30s, hair tied back, her uniform neatly ironed. The little girl beside her had big brown eyes and carried a small clay pot with a dying lavender sprout inside. When the gate opened, Grace whispered, "Mama, do you think he'll like flowers?" Maria hesitated. "We're just here to clean, sweetheart. Don't talk too much." Thomas watched them from the porch. He didn't smile. "You're the new housekeeper?" His voice was polite, distant. "Yes, sir," Maria said. "This is my daughter, Grace. She'll stay quiet, I promise." He nodded once and turned away. "The staff wing is at the back. Don't go near the north room." Grace looked up curiously. "What's in the north room?" Thomas didn't answer. He was already walking back into his study, closing the door as if shutting the world out again. For the next few days, the rhythm of silence continued. Maria cleaned, cooked, kept her head down. Grace explored corners of the house quietly, whispering to the dying lavender as if it could hear. "We'll find you some sun, don't worry," she told it. Sometimes, she saw the man in the hallway, tall, gray at the temples, always holding a phone but never speaking into it. She wanted to say hello, but something in his eyes made her stay quiet. In the evenings, Maria often glanced toward the north hallway, where a faint light glowed beneath a door. She had heard a soft, mechanical rhythm once, like breathing, but she didn't ask questions. Work was work. One afternoon, Grace followed the gardener, old Ben, out to the back garden. He was trimming the grapevines. "You're the new helper, huh?" he asked kindly. "I'm just visiting with Mama," Grace said, digging her shoes into the soil. "This house feels sad." Ben looked up at the mansion. "You're not wrong, little one. Sometimes walls remember what hearts forget." Grace didn't quite understand, but she liked how he said it. She planted her lavender pot near the edge of the path, pressing the soil with her tiny hands. "There, now you can breathe again." From the upstairs window, Thomas saw her. For a moment, something unfamiliar stirred inside him. Annoyance, maybe, or curiosity. A child putting dirt into his manicured garden. But he didn't stop her. That night, as he walked past Ethan's room, the machine's hum felt louder. He glanced at his son's face, pale and still, then at the small stuffed bear on the nightstand. He remembered his wife's laughter echoing through the hall years ago. "He's got your eyes, Tom," she used to say. Thomas whispered now, almost ashamed of the sound of his own voice. "He's got my silence, too." He turned off the light and left the room in darkness. The following morning, the house smelled faintly of coffee and lemon polish. Maria was wiping the kitchen counters when Grace wandered in, still barefoot, holding her flower pot. "Mama, can I put this near the window? It needs more light." Maria smiled softly. "Go ahead, but don't make a mess, cariño." And Grace carried the pot to the window in the dining room. The morning sun slipped through the glass, landing on the lavender's fragile leaves. It looked almost alive again. From behind, a man's voice startled her. "That's my dining table, not a greenhouse." Thomas stood there, still in his pressed shirt, tie loosened, holding his coffee mug. His tone wasn't cruel, only tired. Grace froze for a moment, then spoke in the small, clear way only children could. The plant was dying. Plants die in the dark. Thomas stared at her. For a strange, breathless second, the sentence echoed deeper than it should have. Plants die in the dark. Something inside him tightened, but he quickly turned away. "Keep it near the window then," he said and left. Grace blinked, surprised that he hadn't yelled. She whispered to the plant, "See? He's not so bad." That afternoon, Maria found her daughter sitting cross-legged in the hallway, sketching with a dull pencil on the back of a grocery list. "What are you drawing?" she asked. Grace smiled. "The man's face. He looks like someone who forgot how to smile." Maria gently took the paper. "Don't let him see that." "He won't," Grace promised. "He doesn't look at people anyway." In his office, Thomas was indeed not looking at people. He was looking at numbers, contracts, and glowing screens. The sound of the little girl's voice still lingered in his mind, though. He rubbed his temple, annoyed at how something so simple could stay. Later, when the sun began to set, he heard laughter, a sound so alien in that house, it made him stop typing. He followed it through the hall, past the portraits and the echo of his own footsteps, until he reached the back door. In the yard, Grace was kneeling by the flower bed. She had found the gardener's watering can and was pretending to run a tiny nursery. "This one is sleepy," she said to Ben, who was sweeping nearby. "But if I give it enough love, it'll wake up." Thomas watched quietly. Ethan's window overlooked the same garden. He imagined, for a second, that the boy might be able to hear that laughter through the glass. The thought unsettled him, yet he couldn't move away. When Maria called her daughter in for dinner, Grace ran past him without noticing he was there. Her lavender pot wobbled slightly in her hands, a few drops of water falling on the marble floor. One drop landed on his shoe. She stopped. "I'm sorry, mister." He shook his head. "It's just water." But long after she left, Thomas kept staring at the little wet spot, as if it were something precious that would soon disappear. That night, the wind rose over the vineyards, brushing the curtains of Ethan's room. Thomas sat beside his son, watching the boy's still face. The machines blinked, breathing for him. On the nightstand, the bear lay against the lamp, its fur fading. Thomas whispered, "She said plants die in the dark. Maybe boys do too." His voice cracked. He had never said anything like that aloud before. He reached for the curtain cord but stopped midway. His hand trembled, unsure. Then, slowly, he pulled it open. Moonlight flooded the room, touching the boy's cheek. Down in the garden, Grace's lavender swayed gently in the same silver light. The house that had once drowned in silence seemed, for the briefest instant, to sigh. And somewhere down the long hallway, a door creaked softly open. Ethan's door. The sound had been faint, like a whisper caught in the dark, but it stayed with Thomas long after he convinced himself it was only the wind. The next morning, he walked down the hallway again, pretending not to glance at Ethan's door. The machine's soft rhythm still hummed, steady and unchanged, but something about the room felt different, as if the air itself had shifted overnight. In the kitchen, Maria was setting breakfast on the counter. She greeted him with a polite nod. Grace was already there, sitting on a stool, legs swinging, the lavender pot beside her plate. "Good morning, Mr. Cole," Maria said. "Would you like eggs today?" He waved a hand. "Just coffee." Grace smiled. "Coffee doesn't make you smile." Thomas blinked, surprised by the boldness. "And how would you know that?" "Because you drink it every day and you never smile." Maria froze, eyes widening in alarm. "Grace, I'm so sorry." But Thomas lifted a hand. "It's all right," he said quietly. He poured his own coffee and sat at the far end of the table. "Maybe you're right." Grace watched him as she buttered her toast, curious, like a kitten studying a stranger. She had noticed something about this house that grown-ups seemed to ignore. Everyone moved softly, as if afraid to wake the silence itself. After breakfast, Maria went upstairs to dust the hallways. Grace followed her, skipping over the polished floor, humming to her plant. When they reached the north hallway, the one Thomas had warned them not to enter, Grace stopped. The air there felt colder. A thin strip of light slid out from under a closed door. "Mama," she whispered, "is that the room?" Maria hesitated. "Yes, the one we stay away from." "Why?" "Because the man said so." Grace frowned. "But maybe the person inside is lonely." "Grace, please," Maria said, soft but firm. "Let's go." They moved on. Yet as they passed, Grace placed her tiny hand on the doorknob. It was cool to the touch, too cool. She felt a pulse of curiosity, like a little spark running up her arm. She whispered, "Hi," so quietly it might have been mistaken for a sigh. Inside, Ethan didn't move, but his breathing paused for half a second, then steadied again. Later that afternoon, the sky turned gray. Thomas worked in his office until the clouds dimmed the light. From his window, he saw Grace in the garden again, kneeling by the lavender. Ben, the gardener, handed her a small spade. "Why do you like that flower so much?" he asked. Grace smiled. "Because it smells like happy memories." Ben chuckled. "You sure you've got any of those, kid?" She shrugged. "Maybe not mine, but someone else's." Thomas could hear their laughter faintly through the open window. It reached him like a sound from another life. For the first time in months, he didn't shut the window to block it out. He just sat there, listening. As the rain began to fall, Grace hurried to move her lavender closer to the porch. She looked up and saw Thomas watching her. "Don't worry," she said. "I'll keep it safe." He wanted to tell her it didn't matter, that one small flower couldn't change anything. But when he saw her cupping it carefully with both hands, something stopped him. Instead, he said, "You should come inside before it rains harder." "Will you help me carry it?" she asked. He hesitated, then walked down the steps. The rain dotted his shirt, cool and clean. Together, they lifted the pot and brought it to the porch. Grace smiled up at him. "Thank you, mister." It's Thomas," he said quietly. She grinned. "Okay, Thomas." He almost laughed. It had been years since anyone had said his name like that, so simply, without the weight of title or respect. Just Thomas. The rain fell harder as the evening came. Thunder rolled softly over the vineyards, a deep, slow murmur that made the house seem even larger and emptier. Maria was folding laundry in the staff room when Grace tugged her sleeve. "Mama, can I check on my plant? I left it by the window in the hall." "Not now, Carino. It's raining too much." "Tomorrow, all right?" But curiosity had its own rhythm. When Maria turned away, Grace slipped quietly out, her small feet padding over the wooden floor. The lights along the hallway flickered softly, reflecting off the framed portraits that lined the wall's faces from another time, all staring silently ahead. She found the lavender near the big window, droplets of rain gliding down the glass behind it. The air smelled like wet soil and lemon wax. Grace touched one of the leaves gently. "You did good, little plant. You're still alive." Somewhere behind her, a low electronic hum came through the wall. She followed the sound, drawn as if by instinct, until she stood before the door at the end of the corridor, the forbidden one. The light beneath it shimmered faintly, bluish and soft. Grace listened. A rhythm pulsed beyond like breathing. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the knob. "Hello?" she whispered. "It's me again, the girl with the plant." Nothing answered. The hum continued. Then a sudden flash of lightning lit the hall, and in its echo, she thought she heard a faint click from the other side of the door, almost like a sigh. The handle turned a fraction. The door wasn't locked. Her heart thumped. She pushed it open just enough to peek inside. The room was dim, lit by the glow of monitors. A boy lay in the bed, pale as the sheets. A small machine whispering beside him. His eyes were closed, lashes dark against skin that looked too thin, too still. Grace stepped inside, the lavender scent still clinging to her hands. She moved quietly until she stood beside the bed. "Hi," she said softly. "You must be the one everyone's afraid to talk about." The boy didn't move. She leaned closer, studying his face. "You look lonely," she murmured. "But that's okay. My plant was lonely too." For a moment, she thought he didn't hear. Then one of his fingers twitched. Barely. but real. Grace gasped quietly, then smiled. "See? You can still hear me." She placed the lavender pot on the small table next to his bed. "This is for you. It smells like spring. You can borrow it until you wake up." Behind her, the hallway lights flickered again. Footsteps echoed faintly from down the corridor, Thomas returning from his office. Unaware, Grace turned toward the door and whispered quickly, "Don't tell anyone I came, okay? It's our secret." Then she ran out just before Thomas reached the corner. He stopped, noticing the door ajar. For a second, he thought he saw a shadow slipping away, but when he stepped inside, nothing had changed. The machines hummed, the boy slept, and the air smelled faintly of lavender. He frowned, closing the door gently. Down the hall, Grace ducked behind the staircase, clutching her empty hands, smiling to herself. She could still feel the warmth of the boy's room, quiet but alive. She whispered, "Good night, sleepyhead," and tiptoed back to her mother. That night, as the rain finally stopped, a faint tremor ran through the cables of the machine beside Ethan's bed. His hand moved once more, a tiny motion that no one saw. And in the garden below, the lavender that had been left behind glowed faintly beneath the moonlight, as if breathing with him. The next morning began with a kind of hush that always comes after rain, the world washed clean, the air smelling of earth and wet leaves. Grace woke early and ran barefoot to the porch, eager to see if her lavender had survived. It had. Drops of rain still clung to the purple petals, glittering like tiny jewels. In the kitchen, Maria was making pancakes. She had learned that Thomas liked his breakfast simple, always at the same time, always alone. Grace sat at the counter, chin resting on her hands, waiting for him. When Thomas appeared, he looked tired. There were dark circles under his eyes, as if sleep hadn't stayed long. He poured coffee without a word. "Good morning," Grace chirped. He glanced at her, almost startled by her brightness. "Good morning. You look like you didn't sleep." "Maybe I didn't. Bad dreams?" Thomas hesitated, then gave a small smile. "Something like that." Grace nodded, satisfied, as if she had diagnosed him properly. "Then you should do something fun. That helps." "Fun?" He sounded unfamiliar with the word. "Yeah, like planting something, or playing in the mud." Thomas nearly laughed, but it came out as a breath instead. "I don't think I'm the mud type." "Everybody's the mud type," she said seriously. "That's where life starts." Maria shot her daughter a warning look. "Grace." But Thomas only shook his head slightly. "It's all right. She might be right." He didn't know why he said it. Maybe because the house did feel different that morning, the silence seemed softer, almost breathing again. Later, when the sun broke through the clouds, Grace asked if she could help Ben in the garden. Thomas allowed it, with a warning. "Stay where he can see you." Grace grinned. "Yes, sir." The garden was still wet, the soil dark and rich. Ben handed her a small trowel. "You like getting dirty, don't you?" Grace giggled. "Mut makes me happy." Ben smiled. "Then you're in the right place." They worked quietly for a while, the sounds of shoveling and birdsong blending into a calm rhythm. When Grace looked up, she saw Thomas standing by the porch, watching them with his hands in his pockets. "Come join," she called. He almost refused out of habit, but something in her tone, so natural and trusting, pulled him forward. He stepped off the porch and knelt down, the knees of his trousers immediately soaking through. Grace laughed softly. "See? You're a mud type after all." He gave her a look halfway between surprise and surrender. "I suppose so." Grace dug up a small patch of earth. "This is for Ethan," she said suddenly. Thomas froze. "How do you know that name?" Grace didn't look up. "It was written on the door. I saw it a little bit." He stared at her, trying to decide if he was angry or just stunned. "You went in there?" "Just for a second," she admitted. He looked lonely. "Grace!" Maria's voice rang out from the porch, sharp and frightened. But before Thomas could respond, Grace continued softly. "I left him my plant. It smells like spring. He liked it, I think." Thomas's throat tightened. "You shouldn't have gone there," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. The image of the lavender beside Ethan's bed came to him suddenly, and with it, the faint scent he'd noticed the night before. He stood up, brushing dirt from his hands, but his palms stayed stained. Grace held up her own, covered in mud, smiling proudly. "It's okay," she said. Mud washes off. For some reason, that sentence hit him deeper than he expected. He looked down at his hands again, the dirt brown against the pale skin, and whispered, almost to himself, "Maybe not all of it." "End of." Grace tilted her head. "You just have to let the rain help." He didn't answer, but something in her words stayed with him, clinging like the mud that refused to come off. That afternoon, when Maria called her daughter inside, Thomas stayed in the garden. The air was warm now, the smell of soil thick and comforting. He picked up the little spade Grace had left behind and turned a patch of earth himself. It felt strange, humbling to touch something alive with his own hands. He hadn't done that in years. When he went inside, he passed by Ethan's door again. The faint scent of lavender was stronger now. He lingered a moment, hand resting on the handle, before walking on. He didn't see it, but inside the room, Ethan's fingers twitched again, brushing against the blanket. The machine's rhythm changed just slightly, as if syncing with the quiet heartbeat of the house. The sun was setting when Grace found herself back in the garden. The rain puddles from the day before had not yet dried, and her bare feet splashed softly through them. She carried a small tin bucket once shiny, now dented and scuffed with the lavender plant inside. Thomas was sitting on the porch steps, papers forgotten on his lap, lost in thought. He looked up as she came over. "Where are you going with that?" "To visit my friend," she said simply. He frowned. "Your friend?" Grace nodded, her tone calm and matter-of-fact. "The boy upstairs." Thomas opened his mouth to stop her, but the words didn't come. Instead, he sighed. "Grace, you can't—" But she was already halfway up the steps. Maria appeared in the hallway just as Grace passed. "Grace, where do you think you're—" "I'll be quiet, Mama," the girl whispered. "Promise." Maria looked helplessly at Thomas, who stood frozen by the door. For a long moment, none of them moved. Then he gave a small nod, barely perceptible, but enough. Grace slipped down the corridor, the bucket clinking softly against her leg. The air beyond Ethan's door was still cool, but not unfriendly. She pushed it open again and stepped inside. The machines blinked faintly in rhythm. Ethan lay as before, but something about him seemed different, his breathing lighter, less mechanical, as if he had started listening to the world. Grace placed the bucket beside the bed. "Hi again," she whispered. "It's me." She reached out and touched the back of his hand with her muddy fingers. "Sorry, I got dirt on you. But maybe that's okay. Dirt makes things grow." Ethan's hand twitched. Then his fingers, almost imperceptibly, curled toward hers. Grace gasped, covering her mouth. "You moved," she whispered excitedly. "You really did." She looked around, half expecting someone to come rushing in, but the house was quiet. Only the steady rhythm of the monitors answered her. Grace sat on the floor beside the bed. She dipped her hands into the bucket, scooping up a handful of wet soil. "This is what the world feels like," she said softly. "It's cold and soft and warm all at once. You can feel everything in it if you listen." She pressed a little of the mud onto the back of Ethan's hand. "There," she whispered. "Now you're part of it too." For a few moments, nothing happened. Then, from the corner of her eye, Grace saw movement. His eyelids trembled. Her heart pounded. "Ethan?" she said quietly. The boy didn't wake, not fully, but his breathing changed again. His chest rose deeper, steadier. Grace smiled through tears. She didn't understand. "You like it," she said. "I knew you would." She sat there for a while longer, humming a tune her mother often sang while cleaning a lullaby in Spanish, soft and low. The sound seemed to fill the room, smoothing its sharp edges. When Thomas came up later, he found the door slightly open again. Inside, Grace had fallen asleep on the chair beside the bed, her small hand still resting near Ethan's. Mud smudged both their fingers. He stood there for a long time, afraid to disturb them. The machine's steady beeping sounded less like a countdown now and more like a heartbeat. He looked at the lavender, blooming faintly under the dim light, and something inside him cracked a quiet realization that maybe his son wasn't completely gone. Thomas knelt by the chair, brushing a lock of hair from Grace's forehead. "What are you doing to us, kid?" he whispered. Grace stirred but didn't wake. Her fingers twitched, still loosely linked with Ethan's. Thomas straightened up, staring at the two of them. The sight was both fragile and overwhelming, like watching a miracle unfold, too delicate to speak aloud. As he stepped quietly back toward the door, he heard it. A small, broken sound. Not a breath, not a sigh. A word, barely formed, but real. Light? Thomas froze. His heart stopped for a moment, unsure if it was his imagination. Grace murmured in her sleep. "He's talking, Mr. Thomas. He's just a little slow." He turned toward her, stunned. "Grace!" She smiled faintly without opening her eyes. "I told you, mud makes things grow." From somewhere down the hallway came the soft sound of a door creaking open. Ethan's door. Morning light slipped through the curtains in thin, golden lines, tracing gentle patterns across the floor. The storm had cleared, leaving behind a crisp air that smelled faintly of pine and wet wood. Thomas stood by the window of his study, coffee cooling in his hands. But his thoughts were still upstairs, still with that one fragile sound he'd heard the night before. He had told himself it couldn't be real. Maybe it was the machine's static, or his own mind playing tricks. Yet the more he tried to dismiss it, the more he replayed the word in his head, light. The weight had broken the silence like a whisper from somewhere beyond reason. Downstairs, Grace sat on the floor near the fireplace, her lavender bucket beside her. She was shaping little mounds of soil she had brought in from the garden, humming softly. Maria frowned when she saw her. "Grace, not here, Carino," she said. "You'll make a mess." Grace smiled up at her. "But it's for him." Maria paused. "For who?" "Ethan," Grace said simply, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Thomas entered the room just in time to hear the name. His footsteps faltered. "What did you say?" Grace blinked. "I said I'm making something for Ethan. He said light last night." Maria froze, her eyes snapping to Thomas. "She must have imagined it," she whispered quickly. But Grace shook her head, determined. "No. He said it. I heard it. You can ask him." Thomas knelt down slowly, his face unreadable. "Grace," he said softly, "you need to tell me exactly what happened." So she did in the simple, innocent language of a child. She told him about the lavender, the mud, how she'd sung to him, and how his fingers had moved. She told him how she thought maybe the earth helped him feel things that people couldn't. By the time she finished, the room had gone utterly still. The only sound was the faint ticking of the wall clock. Maria's voice trembled. "Mr. Cole, she's just a little girl. Maybe she—" "She's not lying," Thomas interrupted. His tone wasn't sharp, it was calm, almost reverent. "I heard him too." Maria covered her mouth, her eyes filling with tears she didn't understand. Grace stood and took his hand. "Can we go see him again?" Thomas hesitated. Every rational thought told him it was impossible. Doctors had said Ethan's vocal cords were non-responsive, that the damage was irreversible. But reason had lost some of its authority in this house lately. "Come on," Grace urged gently, tugging his sleeve. "He's waiting." They walked together down the long hallway. The house felt different now, lighter, somehow awake after years of holding its breath. When Thomas opened the door, the lavender scent greeted them like an old friend. Ethan lay still, but not lifeless. There was color in his cheeks now, faint but there. Grace climbed onto the chair beside him, her bare feet swinging. "Hi again," she whispered. "I brought you more dirt." Thomas exhaled, caught between disbelief and awe. Grace placed a small patch of damp soil on Ethan's palm, just as she had before. "Remember what I said? The world talks through touch. You can listen if you want." For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, slowly, Ethan's fingers began to close, not just twitch, but truly move, curling around the mud. Thomas stepped closer, unable to breathe. Grace smiled. "See? He likes it." And then it came again, faint, cracked, but undeniable. "Light." The room went silent. Thomas's throat tightened. "Ethan," he whispered. The boy's eyes fluttered, not open, but aware. His lips trembled, the sound barely forming. "Light?" he said again, clearer this time. His voice soft and broken, but alive. Grace laughed through tears, clapping her muddy hands together. "You did it! You said it again!" Thomas fell into the nearest chair, his heart pounding like he'd just run miles. He covered his face. Laughter and tears tangled together in a sound he hadn't made in years. When he finally looked up, Grace was talking softly to Ethan, telling him about the sunrise outside, about how the world smelled new today. Thomas realized then that this wasn't science. It wasn't logic. It was something older, simpler, the language of mud, touch, and love that no machine had ever tried. He stood slowly and placed his hand on Ethan's arm. The boy didn't flinch. His breathing steadied, his fingers still curled around the soil. Thomas whispered, "Welcome back, son." And for the first time, it didn't sound like a prayer of loss. It sounded like hope. By noon, the house was no longer quiet. Dr. Jensen, the neurologist who had once declared Ethan's condition beyond cognitive repair, was standing beside the boy's bed, flipping through his old medical charts like someone searching for a hidden trick. 2 nurses hovered near the machines, whispering in disbelief. Thomas stood by the window, arms crossed, his reflection trembling in the glass. Grace sat in her usual spot beside Ethan, swinging her feet, watching the adults with a patience that only children seem to possess. Dr. Jensen cleared his throat. "Mr. Cole, I need to be perfectly clear. What your staff described, what you believe you heard, could have been an involuntary reflex." Thomas didn't turn. He said, "Light, doctor." Twice. With respect," Jensen replied. "Auditory misinterpretation is common under emotional distress, especially when a family member—" Thomas's voice cut in, calm but firm. "I wasn't imagining it." The doctor hesitated, glancing toward Grace. "And the girl?" Grace smiled sweetly. "He talked to me." Jensen blinked, clearly unprepared for such certainty from someone so small. "He talked to you?" She nodded. "He felt the dirt. Then he said the word. You don't have to believe me, it's okay. But he'll say it again when he's ready." The room went still. Jensen looked back to Thomas, searching for logic, but found none. "I can run another series of tests." "No," Thomas said quietly. "No more tests. Not yet." Jensen frowned. "Then what would you suggest?" Thomas looked at his son, then at the bucket on the nightstand. "We let him rest, and we let her stay." The doctor wanted to argue, but something in Thomas's tone stopped him. With a tight nod, he gathered his papers and left. The nurses followed, whispering about what they'd seen or what they thought they'd seen. When the door closed, silence returned, but it was different now. No longer sterile, no longer heavy. Grace slid off the chair and knelt beside the bed. "They don't get it," she said softly. "You don't need big machines, do you? Just someone to sit with you." Thomas sat down across from her, rubbing his temples. "Grace, I don't understand any of this." The doctor said there was no brain activity linked to speech, none. Grace didn't answer right away. She looked up at him, her small hands still resting over Ethan's. "Maybe the part they couldn't find wasn't broken," she said simply. "Maybe it was just lonely." Thomas felt the words hit him like a wave. He had spent years trying to fix, to measure, to analyze, but never to listen. He exhaled, shaking his head. "You know, Grace, you sound older than you are." She giggled. "That's what my teacher used to say." Outside, the late afternoon sun spilled across the floor, filling the room with light so warm that for a moment it didn't feel like a sick room at all. Ethan's hand twitched again. Thomas leaned forward instinctively, watching. The boy's fingers brushed against the lavender leaves. A faint smile ghosted across his lips, fragile, uncertain, but real. Grace gasped, her voice a whisper of joy. "He's happy." "Oh." Thomas felt something collapse inside him, the hard shell he'd built around his grief, cracking under the weight of that small, impossible smile. He whispered, "I almost forgot what that looks like." Grace nodded solemnly. "Then, you have to remember now." They sat there as the sun dipped lower, the color of honey pouring through the curtains. Maria appeared at the door but didn't speak. She just leaned against the frame, eyes wide, one hand pressed over her heart. When Thomas finally stood, he did something he hadn't done in years. He reached out, brushing his son's hair gently from his forehead. "Light," Ethan whispered again, so softly it was almost part of the wind. Grace beamed. "See? He remembers the word." Thomas couldn't speak. He only nodded, tears sliding silently down his face. That night, after Grace had gone to bed, he returned to Ethan's room alone. The lavender scent lingered in the air, mingling with the faint smell of earth. He sat beside the bed and spoke quietly, his voice trembling. "I don't know how this happened, son. Maybe it's her. Maybe it's God. Maybe it's just love finding a way back. He smiled weakly. Whatever it is, I'm not running anymore. He took Ethan's hand, warm now, no longer cold, and stayed there until dawn. And when the first morning light entered the room, it landed gently on both their faces, as if to say, "You were never truly in the dark." From somewhere down the hallway came the soft sound of a door creaking open Ethan's door. By the next morning, the mansion no longer felt like the same place. The air had changed, softer, brighter, like the house itself had exhaled after holding its breath for too many years. The sunlight that spilled through the wide windows no longer seemed intrusive. It felt like a guest that had finally been welcomed back. Grace woke before Maria and tiptoed down the hall with her bucket, careful not to make the old floorboards creak. She opened Ethan's door slowly, the hinges sighing in recognition. Inside, the lavender still stood by the bed, blooming a little more than the day before. "Hi," she whispered. "It's morning again." Ethan didn't answer, but his fingers moved slightly, tracing the air near the blanket. Grace smiled, taking that as a hello. She sat beside him and began humming the same tune as always, the soft Spanish lullaby that had somehow become their language. Downstairs, Thomas was pacing in the kitchen. His coffee sat untouched, growing cold as he stared out the window toward the garden. He could still hear that word echoing in his mind, light. It wasn't just sound, it had meaning. It had broken through something he thought was unbreakable. Maria entered quietly, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. "You didn't sleep again, did you?" Thomas gave a half smile. "I keep thinking about what she said." "Grace?" "Yes, that maybe the part of him that's missing is just lonely." Maria nodded slowly. Children say the truth without realizing it. He turned to face her, his eyes tired but alive. What if it's not a miracle? What if it's just love doing what medicine couldn't? Maria's eyes softened. "Then maybe that's the only miracle that ever mattered." Before he could answer, a soft sound came from upstairs, the faint melody of Grace's humming. Without a word, Thomas started toward the staircase. When he reached the door, he didn't open it immediately. He stood there, listening. The tune floated through the air, sweet and steady, and then another sound joined it. Not music, a voice. It was soft, broken, unsure, but unmistakably real. Thomas pushed the door open. Grace was sitting cross-legged on the floor, her bucket of soil between them, showing Ethan how to press his fingers into the mud. "You just feel it," she said. "Don't think. Just feel." Ethan's lips moved again. "Mud," he whispered. The word was heavy, thick with effort, but clear enough to make Thomas's knees give way. Grace looked up, her face glowing. "He said another one!" Thomas stared, unable to speak. He sat down slowly beside the bed, taking in the impossible, the boy who had once been silent now repeating the words of the world. "Mud," Ethan said again, and this time his voice trembled with something close to laughter. Grace clapped her hands. "You're getting good at this!" Thomas leaned closer, his voice trembling. "Ethan, can you hear me?" Ethan's head turned slightly toward the sound, his eyelids fluttering. For a moment, Thomas thought he saw recognition not in the eyes, but in the way his son breathed, as if he was listening. "It's Dad," Thomas said softly, his throat tightening. "I'm here." Ethan's hand moved toward him, slow but deliberate. His fingers brushed against Thomas's wrist, leaving a faint mark of soil there, a touch that said more than any word could. Grace smiled at the sight. "He knows you." Thomas swallowed hard. Maybe he always did. For the rest of the morning, they stayed like that, the three of them sitting in the soft light, surrounded by the smell of earth and lavender. The machines hummed quietly, no longer the loudest thing in the room. Maria watched from the doorway, tears in her eyes. She didn't dare interrupt. It was as if time itself had decided to stand still, to make space for something sacred. Thomas looked around at the little girl, the bucket, the boy who was waking slowly from silence, and realized that what he felt wasn't confusion anymore. It was hope. Pure, unmeasured hope. He hadn't felt it in years, and yet it fit perfectly, like it had been waiting all along. As the sunlight climbed higher, Grace leaned close to Ethan and whispered, "You can keep practicing, okay? Tomorrow, we'll try Sunday." Ethan's lips curved faintly. "Son," he echoed, the sound thin but alive. Thomas laughed through a breath that shook. "God help me," he whispered, He's learning to talk again. Grace grinned. See? I told you mud makes everything better. From somewhere downstairs, a faint knock echoed against the heavy front door, unexpected, steady, pulling Thomas back to the world beyond the miracle. Maria called up the stairs. "Mr. Cole, someone's here to see you." Thomas frowned. Who could it be? Grace looked up, eyes curious. Maybe it's another doctor. Oh. But in his gut, Thomas knew it wasn't. The voice that had just spoken from below didn't belong to a doctor at all. It carried the calm assurance of someone who wasn't here for science but for truth. He rose slowly, casting one last glance at his son. "Stay with him, Grace." She nodded. "Always." Thomas walked toward the stairs, heart thudding, unaware that what waited beyond that door would change everything once again. Thomas took the stairs one at a time, each step heavier than the last. The sunlight spilling through the tall windows didn't calm him this time. It only sharpened the uncertainty sitting in his chest. At the bottom of the staircase stood a woman in her 50s, wearing a gray coat still damp from the morning drizzle. Her hair, streaked with silver, was tied back neatly. She held a small folder against her chest and a cautious smile on her face. "Mr. Cole?" she asked. Her voice was calm, but carried an undertone of something practiced the sound of someone used to bringing difficult news. "Yes," he replied. "Can I help you?" She extended her hand. "Dr. Evelyn Monroe. I worked with your son's medical team about 6 years ago. I was one of the early consultants on his case before I left the program." Thomas hesitated but shook her hand. "I remember the name. You signed one of the early reports." "Yes," she said softly, lowering her gaze. "And I came today because I've regretted it ever since." Maria, who had been standing quietly nearby, exchanged a wary glance with Thomas. "Regretted it?" Dr. Monroe opened the folder and pulled out several worn documents. "Your son's file, the first year after his diagnosis. I've been reviewing old cases, and I realized something that should never have been overlooked." Thomas felt his pulse quicken. "Go on." "The early tests," she said, handing him the papers. "They weren't conclusive. Ethan showed small but consistent reflex responses, movement in the throat muscles, variations in oxygen flow when hearing familiar voices. Those findings were dismissed as involuntary reactions and, well, sedation was increased to keep him calm." Thomas's hands trembled as he held the papers. "Sedation," he repeated. "You mean they silenced him?" Dr. Monroe nodded, shame flickering in her eyes. "We were told to manage expectations. His case was labeled non-responsive, and the pharmaceutical sponsors were pushing for data that aligned with that conclusion. It was wrong. All of it." Maria gasped softly, covering her mouth. For a moment, Thomas said nothing. The room seemed to shrink around him, filled with the weight of everything he hadn't questioned all the years he'd trusted the experts while his son slept in silence. He looked up, his voice low but trembling with anger. "Do you have any idea what that did to him? To us?" "Yes," Monroe said quietly. "That's why I'm here. I needed you to know the truth and to see that what's happening now isn't impossible. It's recovery. His brain was never dead, Mr. Cole. It was suppressed. And now, something's waking it up." Thomas took a step back, his hand gripping the edge of the counter for balance. "Suppressed," he murmured. "All this time, we could have reached him." Dr. Monroe's eyes softened. "You still can." He looked toward the staircase, where faint laughter now drifted from above Grace's laughter, bright and alive. "I'm not sure it's the doctors who are helping him now." Monroe followed his gaze. "The girl?" Thomas nodded slowly. "She talks to him like he can hear, touches him, makes him part of the world again. It's not science, but it's working." The doctor smiled faintly. "Sometimes connection is the best medicine." He exhaled, rubbing his eyes. "I don't even know what to do with all this." "Start by forgiving yourself," she said gently. "You believed what you were told. Now you know better." He met her eyes, voice rough. "That's easier said than done." She closed the folder and placed it on the counter. "Then start by believing in him. The rest will follow." As Dr. Monroe left, the front door clicked shut behind her, and Thomas stood alone in the silence she left behind. Outside, the wind stirred the leaves, soft, steady, alive. He climbed the stairs slowly, the folder still clutched in his hand. The hallway smelled faintly of lavender and soil again, a fragrance that had become both reminder and promise. When he entered the room, Grace looked up from beside Ethan's bed, her hands covered in mud as usual. "He said another word," she said excitedly. Thomas's voice was barely a whisper. "What word?" She smiled, her eyes glowing. "Dad." He froze. His breath caught. He said, "Dad?" Grace nodded, still grinning. "Just once. Soft. But I heard it." Thomas dropped the folder onto the chair and moved closer, falling to his knees beside the bed. "Ethan?" he whispered. The boy's lips parted slightly. His voice was broken but clear enough to shatter every wall Thomas had ever built. "Dad?" Tears filled Thomas's eyes instantly. He took his son's hand, pressing it against his face. "I'm here," he said, choking on the words. "I'm here, son. I'm sorry I didn't hear you sooner." Grace watched quietly, her eyes shining. "He was waiting for you to listen." Thomas turned to her, voice trembling. "I think you're right." Outside, the light grew softer, pouring through the window like gold spilled across the floor. Ethan's breathing steadied again, his hand still held tightly in his father's. The house, once heavy with silence, now pulsed with something new, a heartbeat of hope, fragile but alive. And as the evening settled, a single sound echoed through the mansion, not from machines, but from life itself. "Dad." Once more, clearer. From somewhere down the hallway came the soft sound of a door creaking open. Ethan's door. The next morning came slow and golden, sunlight creeping through the mansion's long windows like a patient visitor. For the first time in years, Thomas didn't dread waking up. He sat on the edge of his bed, still in yesterday's shirt, staring at the faint marks of mud on his hands, proof that what he'd seen wasn't a dream. Down the hall, Grace's laughter blended with the steady beeping of Ethan's monitor. That sound, once cold and mechanical, now felt like part of the rhythm of life returning to the house. Maria entered the room carrying a tray. "Coffee, sir. You didn't eat much last night." He smiled faintly. "I don't think I could have swallowed anything if I tried." She hesitated, then set the tray down and folded her hands. "You believe it now, don't you?" He nodded slowly. "He said my name. Twice. I used to think I'd give anything to hear that again. And when it finally happened, I didn't know what to do." Maria smiled softly. "Maybe you don't need to do anything yet. Just listen." He looked up at her, thoughtful. "You always make it sound simple, because love usually is," she said. He chuckled under his breath. "Grace gets that from you." Maria's eyes shimmered. "Grace gets her faith from somewhere else entirely?" When Thomas went downstairs later, he noticed something strange. One of the doors at the far end of the hallway, the one that led down to the old basement, was slightly open. He hadn't been in that part of the mansion in years. The place had always felt like a tomb for everything he didn't want to face. He paused, fingers resting on the doorframe. Maybe it was the light, or maybe it was instinct, but something told him to go down there. The stairs groaned beneath his weight. Dust floated in the beams of morning light, slicing through the narrow windows. He passed rows of covered furniture, old medical crates, and boxes labeled in thick black marker. Most were marked records, medical. He crouched beside one of them, brushed off a layer of dust, and lifted the lid. Inside were folders, dozens, maybe hundreds, filled with test results, therapy notes, and signatures from doctors he remembered too well. As he flipped through the pages, one word appeared again and again in the margins: sedative. Dosages, schedules, adjustments. He found Dr. Monroe's name in the early pages, her handwriting neat but firm. Then, farther down, another named doctor. Jensen scrawled over the later reports, his recommendations in bold red ink: patient unresponsive, increased dosage, maintain sedation for stability. Thomas's stomach turned. He ran his hand through his hair, anger building with every page. "They didn't even give him a chance," he muttered. He found one file dated 12 years ago. Inside was a printed scan showing faint spikes in brain activity, right underlined words. "Response detected during tactile stimulation." And below it, stamped in red: false positive. Disregard. He slammed the folder shut. From behind him came the soft creak of a step. He turned quickly. Grace was standing halfway down the stairs, clutching her lavender bucket. "What are you doing down here, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "I was looking for you," she said. Maria said you were sad. He tried to smile, but couldn't. I'm not sad. Just learning how much I didn't know. Grace walked closer, peering into the box. Are those Ethan's papers? Yes. He lifted one page and held it in the light. This is what they wrote about him. Every word said he'd never come back, and I believed them. She tilted her head. Maybe they just didn't listen right. Thomas let out a shaky breath, half a laugh, half a sob. You have a way of saying things that makes everything sound simple. It is simple, Grace said softly. You just have to feel instead of think. He looked at her, her small hands, dirt-stained as always, holding that dented bucket like a sacred thing, and realized she was right. She always had been. He crouched down, meeting her eyes. You know, you've done something no one in this house ever could. She blinked. What? You brought him back. Grace smiled, shy but proud. He was always here. I just helped you see him. Thomas swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. You did more than that. They stood together in the dusty basement, the smell of paper and old earth surrounding them. Thomas reached out, resting a hand on her shoulder. Let's bring these upstairs. People should know what really happened. Grace looked toward the shelves, her gaze thoughtful. It's dark down here, she murmured. He nodded. Yeah, it's where I kept my mistakes. She slipped her hand into his. Then let's take them to the light. They carried the boxes up one by one, setting them in the hallway. Each folder felt heavier than the last, not because of the paper, but because of what it held: years of silence, of blindness, of choices made in fear. When they reached the top of the stairs, Thomas turned to look back. The basement lay behind them, quiet and still. For the first time, he didn't see it as a place of ghosts, but as the place where the truth had been buried. And now, at last, it was rising. Upstairs, Maria gasped when she saw the boxes. Senor Thomas, what is all that? The past, he said simply. And I'm done hiding it. She nodded slowly, understanding in her eyes. As he turned toward Ethan's room, Grace tugged at his sleeve. Can I tell him you found it? Thomas smiled faintly. Yes. Tell him I found the truth. From somewhere above, a sound drifted down the hallway, faint, uncertain, but alive. Dal. Ethan's voice again. Softer this time, as if calling him home. Thomas closed his eyes and whispered, I'm coming, son. Then he started down the hall toward the light. By late afternoon, the house was alive with motion again, but this time, it wasn't the restless pacing of worry or grief. It was the sound of papers rustling, drawers opening, and the quiet weight of truth surfacing after years of silence. Thomas had spread the files across the long dining table, sunlight falling in diagonal stripes over the faded ink. Maria stood nearby, carefully dusting the old reports with a cloth before handing them to him one by one. Grace sat cross-legged on a chair, watching as though the papers were puzzle pieces that, when assembled, would tell her why everyone had been so sad for so long. Thomas read another document aloud, his voice steady but trembling underneath. Subject remains unresponsive. Sedation increased to maintain stability. Emotional stimulation deemed counterproductive. Oh. He lowered the page slowly. Counterproductive, he whispered. That's what they called love. Maria crossed herself. Dios mío. Grace frowned. They didn't even try to talk to him. Thomas nodded grimly. No. They measured him, tested him, restrained him, but they never spoke to him. He reached for the final folder, thicker than the rest. The front bore Dr. Jensen's signature in heavy black ink. As Thomas flipped through the pages, his jaw tightened. It wasn't just medical jargon, it was deliberate. Each section ended with the same verdict. Written in Jensen's confident scrawl, no potential for cognitive recovery. Recommend indefinite sedation. At the bottom of one page, however, a faint handwritten note caught Thomas's eye. Smaller, messier, squeezed between lines. Patient responded to name during auditory test. Response dismissed by attending physician. Thomas froze. His pulse quickened. They heard him, he said quietly. He tried to speak, and they silenced him again. Maria covered her mouth. Senor? He stood up suddenly, the chair scraping against the floor. No more hiding this. No more pretending we didn't know. Grace looked up, alarmed but curious. What will you do? Thomas stared at the folder, his voice low but certain. "Tell the world! Every doctor who signed this, everyone who let it happen, will answer for it!" He walked to the old landline phone in the corner, his hand trembling as he dialed. When the line clicked, a familiar voice answered. "Dr. Jensen." Thomas said coldly, "It's Thomas Cole." There was a pause. "Mr. Cole, I heard about the incident. I was going to call you. I understand your son spoke." Thomas interrupted. "He spoke because someone finally treated him like a human being. Not because of your drugs, not because of your machines. Because a little girl touched his hand and sang to him." Silence. Then Jensen's voice, uneasy. "I think we should handle this carefully, Mr. Cole. The press—" "Oh, the press will hear," Thomas snapped. "Every word. I'm opening every file, every report. The world deserves to know what you did to him, what you did to us, Mr. Cole." But Thomas had already hung up. The click echoed through the room like a gavel. He turned back to Maria and Grace. "I'll call Dr. Monroe tonight. She'll help me release this. She's one of the few who still has a conscience." Maria nodded. "You're doing the right thing." Grace tilted her head. "Will the doctors be mad?" Thomas smiled sadly. "Maybe, but sometimes the truth makes people angry before it sets them free." Grace considered this for a moment, then nodded seriously. "Then I'll help you. I can draw pictures for Ethan's story." He laughed softly despite the heaviness in his chest. "I think he'd like that." As the evening deepened, the three of them packed the documents into neat piles. Grace drew small flowers on the corners of the folders with a colored pencil she'd found, saying, "So the truth looks a little happier." Thomas carried the boxes back to his study, placing them under the lamp. His reflection stared back from the window, older, worn, but no longer hollow. He wasn't the same man who had buried himself in work and silence. He was someone learning to live again. Later that night, he returned to Ethan's room. The lavender still glowed faintly in the soft lamplight, and Grace had fallen asleep beside the bed once more. Ethan's breathing was calm, his hand resting loosely over hers. Thomas sat down and whispered, "We found it all, son. Every lie. Every word they used to keep you quiet. But no more." Ethan stirred slightly, his lips moving. A sound escaped, small, soft, but steady. "Home." Thomas froze. Tears filled his eyes instantly. "Yes," he whispered. "You're home." He brushed his hand through his son's hair, the old guilt dissolving into something gentler, a grief that was finally allowed to breathe. He looked toward the doorway, where Maria stood silently with a candle. She met his eyes and nodded once. The house felt full again of voices, of warmth, of truth, and somewhere down the hallway, that familiar sound returned, the slow, steady creak of a door opening. Ethan's door. Only this time, Thomas didn't flinch. He smiled, knowing the house itself was finally opening too. The news broke 3 days later. It began quietly, almost like a rumor, an anonymous post from a medical whistleblower, then a local journalist who picked up the story, and by afternoon, it was everywhere. "Businessman exposes medical cover. Up in son's coma case." The article included scanned pages from the files Thomas had unearthed, pages showing sedation schedules, false reports, and one line that ignited outrage across the country. "Patient responsive. Emotional interaction deemed counterproductive." Within hours, the media descended on the Cole mansion. Reporters lined the driveway, cameras flashing through the iron gate. The story had spread far beyond medicine. It had become a conversation about humanity, about whether silence was ever truly proof of absence. Maria closed the curtains as flashbulbs flickered outside. "Senor Thomas, this is madness." "I know," he said, buttoning his shirt with slow, deliberate calm. "But it's necessary madness." Grace peeked through the gap in the curtain, eyes wide. "Are they all here for Ethan?" "Yes," Thomas replied. "But not the way they should be. They're here for answers." "Then tell them," she said softly. "Tell them what happened." Thomas knelt beside her. "Grace, you've been the reason he came back. But this part they won't understand easily." Grace tilted her head. "Then you just talk like you do to him. Simple and true." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Simple and true. I can do that." By noon, A small podium had been set up in front of the house. Cameras stood in neat rows. Dr. Monroe arrived quietly, her expression calm but resolute. She took her place beside Thomas, a silent ally. The air smelled of cut grass and spring rain. Thomas stepped up to the microphone. The crowd stilled. "My name is Thomas Cole," he began, voice steady. "For 12 years, my son Ethan was called non-responsive. The doctors said he couldn't feel, couldn't think, couldn't hope. And for too long, I believed them." He paused, the wind lifting his words and carrying them over the crowd. "But I was wrong. They were wrong. My son wasn't lost. He was buried under silence we built for him." The cameras clicked furiously. Thomas held up a folder, the same one with Jensen's signature. "Inside these pages are lies written in ink, medical records that say my son didn't respond. But the truth is he did. He responded to touch, to music, to love. He just needed someone to listen." "Oh?" He gestured toward the house. "And that someone wasn't me. It was a little girl who came into our home and spoke the only language that mattered: kindness." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Monroe glanced down, visibly holding back tears. Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger. "We live in a world where silence is too often mistaken for surrender. But silence can be full of life if you care enough to listen." He paused again, scanning the faces before him, reporters, nurses, strangers who had come to witness something rare, a man confessing his blindness and choosing light instead. "I can't undo what was done," he said softly, "but I can promise this. Ethan's story won't stay in the dark. And maybe, if you really hear it, you'll start listening to the quiet voices in your own lives too." There was a hush. For a heartbeat, even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. Then, from behind the open doorway of the mansion, a small figure stepped forward. Grace. She carried her dented tin bucket, lavender still blooming inside. Without fear or hesitation, she climbed the front steps and stood beside Thomas, her hand slipping into his. The crowd melted into silence again. Grace looked up at the reporters, her voice small but clear. "He's not broken," she said. "He just needed someone to stay." Someone in the front row lowered their camera. Another sniffled quietly. Thomas squeezed her hand. "Thank you, Grace," he murmured. She smiled at him. "That's what friends do." Monroe stepped to the microphone next. "Mr. Cole isn't exaggerating," she said firmly. "This case will change how we treat every patient we've ever called unresponsive. Because if there's one thing we've learned, it's that life doesn't stop when we stop believing in it." The applause that followed wasn't thunderous, but deep and real, like the sound of something heavy finally being lifted. As the reporters dispersed, Thomas looked up at the sky, clear, endless, forgiving. He could almost hear Ethan's voice again, whispering that word that had started it all. "Light." He smiled faintly. "Yes, son," he whispered. "We chose the light." Later that evening, the house was quiet again. The reporters were gone, and the lavender glowed softly in the last amber light of sunset. Thomas sat beside Ethan's bed, Grace curled up asleep in the chair beside him. He brushed his son's hair gently and whispered, "They know your story now. The whole world does." Ethan's lips moved, a faint breath escaping. "Home." Thomas's throat tightened. "Yes, Ethan, you're home." Outside, the first fireflies of the season began to shimmer over the garden, tiny lanterns rising in the dark. And somewhere down the long hallway came the soft sound of a door creaking open. Ethan's door. Night fell gently over the Cole mansion, wrapping it in a calm that hadn't existed there for over a decade. The day's noise had faded, the reporters gone, the cameras quiet, and the long driveway empty again. Only the cicadas hummed softly in the distance, their song mingling with the faint rustle of wind through the garden's lavender rose. Inside, the fireplace crackled, sending small bursts of light across the sitting room. Grace sat curled up on the rug, drawing on a piece of paper. Beside her, Maria mended a tear in one of Ethan's old blankets. Thomas stood by the window, looking out at the night sky, the stars like tiny witnesses to a truth that had finally been set free. Maria spoke first. "They'll talk about this for a long time, you know. About what you did." Thomas smiled faintly, not turning around. "I didn't do anything, really. I just stopped pretending I couldn't see." She looked up at him. her eyes full of quiet pride. "That's harder than most people realize." Grace raised her drawing. "Look, Mr. Thomas." He turned. On the paper, she had drawn the house not gray and empty as it once was, but full of light. Every window glowed yellow. In front of it stood 3 small figures holding hands beside a patch of flowers. Thomas knelt down to see it better. "Is that us?" Grace nodded. "You, me, and Maria. And Ethan's window is the brightest one." He smiled, his throat tightening. "That's beautiful, Grace." Maria leaned forward, teasing softly. "You forgot to draw yourself, Nina." Grace shook her head. "No, I didn't. I'm the light coming out of the window." Thomas stared at her, the words hitting deeper than they should have. He swallowed hard. "You really are, aren't you?" Grace giggled. Maybe just a little bit. For a while, no one spoke. The fire snapped and hissed, filling the silence with a comforting rhythm. Thomas finally sat down in the armchair across from the fire. The orange glow softened his features, making him look younger or maybe just lighter. He stared into the flames and spoke quietly. "When Ethan was first diagnosed, I used to sit in this very chair at night. I'd listen to the machines upstairs and tell myself that was enough, that being near him, even if he couldn't hear me, was enough. But it wasn't. I was just afraid." Grace looked up from her drawing. "Afraid of what?" He smiled sadly. "Of loving him again. Of losing him again. Sometimes, Grace, when you lose someone once, you start keeping your heart locked away so it doesn't happen twice." She frowned, thinking about it. "But that's how it gets dark inside." Thomas nodded. "Yes, exactly that." Maria reached across the table and placed a gentle hand on his arm. "You opened it again, Senor. That's all that matters." He covered her hand with his. "I didn't open it alone." Upstairs, the soft hum of Ethan's monitor pulsed through the house like a heartbeat. Every time Thomas heard it now, it no longer sounded like a machine, it sounded like breathing. He leaned back in his chair, eyes closing for a moment. "I used to think redemption was something you earned. Now I think it's something you accept." Maria smiled faintly. "And forgiveness?" He opened his eyes. "That's what comes next." Grace yawned and climbed onto the couch beside Maria, resting her head on the older woman's lap. "Ethan's getting stronger," she murmured sleepily. "He said another word when I left." Thomas leaned forward. "He did? What word?" Grace smiled drowsily. "Light." The fire popped softly, as if agreeing. Thomas whispered, "He remembers." He's learning again," Maria said. "From the beginning." The room fell into peaceful quiet. The kind of quiet that wasn't absence, but fullness, a space made by love, where grief used to live. Thomas looked around at the two of them, Maria humming softly, Grace half asleep with smudges of dirt on her cheek, and felt a warmth spread through his chest that he hadn't known in years. He whispered almost to himself, "This is what home feels like." Maria glanced up. "Si, senor." Finally, outside, the wind carried the scent of lavender through the open window. The night was deep, but gentle. Upstairs, a small voice echoed faintly through the halls, fragile, but determined. "Dad." Thomas's eyes closed, tears slipping down his face. "Yes, Ethan," he whispered. "I'm here." And from somewhere down the hallway came the familiar, soft sound of a door creaking open. Ethan's door, only this time. It didn't sound haunting. It sounded like invitation, like life returning, like light. The dawn came slow, pink and tender, washing over the fields behind the Cole mansion. The sky seemed wider that morning, as if it too had been waiting for this day. Inside, the air was soft with the smell of coffee and lavender. Maria hummed quietly in the kitchen while Grace arranged wildflowers into a small glass jar. "He's going to wake up today," Grace said suddenly, as if she were stating the weather. Maria turned from the stove, her brows lifting. "Cómo lo sabes, mi niña?" Grace smiled, eyes bright. "Because I dreamed it." He said the sun felt warm again. Maria's hands paused over the pan, and for a moment, she didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "Then maybe your dream is smarter than all the doctors." Upstairs, Thomas sat beside Ethan's bed, the morning light spilling across both their faces. The lavender had bloomed again, small, stubborn flowers glowing faintly purple in the pale gold light. He had stopped counting days, Hope was no longer measured in hours or numbers. It was in breaths. In the quiet sound of his son's heart matching his own, he spoke softly, more to fill the air than to expect a reply. "You remember this room, don't you? You used to hide under that desk when you didn't want to take your piano lessons." He smiled faintly. "Your mother used to laugh when you did that. She said you had your own kind of music." For the first time in years, it didn't hurt to say her name. The grief that once burned had cooled into something gentle, the kind of pain that hums softly, like a melody you can finally listen to without breaking. He took Ethan's hand and pressed it between his own. "We're still here, son, all of us, waiting for you." Grace appeared at the doorway, holding the jar of wildflowers. "Can I come in?" Thomas turned and smiled. "Always." She walked in and placed the flowers on the nightstand. "For when he wakes up, they're from the garden." The dirt smelled happy today. Thomas chuckled. "Happy dirt, that's new." She grinned. "It means something good's going to happen." He looked at her, that small bundle of faith wrapped in freckles and kindness. "You always seem to know before anyone else." She shrugged. "I just listen better." They sat together in silence for a while. The morning stretched around them, patient, calm, almost sacred. Then something shifted. A sound soft, almost too faint to notice, escaped from Ethan's throat. A small groan, followed by a deep breath that didn't sound like the mechanical rhythm of the past years. Thomas froze. His hand tightened around Ethan's. "Grace," he whispered. "Did you hear that?" She leaned closer. "He's trying." Ethan's fingers twitched, then moved again, stronger this time. His chest rose deeper, and his head turned slightly toward the light coming through the window. Grace gasped. "He's looking for the Sunday." Thomas's breath caught. "Ethan, it's morning. You can open your eyes now." For a long moment, nothing happened. The seconds stretched, trembling with expectation. Then, slowly, painfully, beautifully, Ethan's eyelids fluttered. The faintest trace of color flickered beneath them. Thomas leaned forward, afraid to breathe. "That's it, son. That's it." Grace pressed both hands over her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. And then, for the first time in 12 years, Ethan opened his eyes. They were the same soft gray as his mother's hazy, unfocused at first, then brightening as they found the light. His gaze moved across the room, pausing when it reached Thomas. The silence that followed was the purest thing Thomas had ever known. He felt his heart ache, his throat close, every wall he had built in his life crumble in that single second. "Ethan," he whispered, his voice shaking. "It's Dad." Ethan's lips parted. It took effort, the kind that demanded years of silence to break, but he formed the words slowly, tenderly, like rediscovering something sacred. "Dad." Thomas exhaled a sound between laughter and a sob, his hands trembling as he pulled his son close. "You're here! You're really here!" Ethan blinked, tears welling in his newly woken eyes. "Light," he whispered. Thomas smiled through his tears. "Yes, son, the light." Grace laughed, clapping her muddy hands together. "I told you he'd wake up." Thomas turned toward her, his voice breaking. "Grace, I don't even know how to thank you." She shook her head. "Don't. Just keep being nice to him." He reached out and pulled her into an embrace. "You have no idea what you've given us." Grace smiled, her voice soft. "I think I do." Maria appeared at the doorway, frozen in disbelief. When she saw Ethan's eyes open, she crossed herself, whispering, "Gracias, Dios mío." Thomas turned toward her, his voice full of wonder. "He's awake, Maria. He's really awake." She began to cry, covering her mouth. "I told you the girl was an angel." Grace looked up at her and giggled. "I'm not an angel. I just like mud." Thomas laughed through his tears, holding Ethan's hand tightly. Outside, the morning wind swept through the open window, carrying the scent of earth and lavender across the room. The light grew warmer, brighter, almost as if the house itself was exhaling, alive again. And for the first time in 12 years, the Cole mansion didn't feel haunted. It felt like home. The day unfolded like a quiet miracle. Doctors came and went, their voices hushed, their disbelief barely concealed. They tested, observed, scribbled notes, yet none could explain how a boy written off for over a decade could simply wake up. But Thomas didn't need explanations anymore. He didn't care for data or theories. Every breath Ethan took was proof enough. By afternoon, sunlight poured through the wide-open windows, golden and full. Ethan rested, his eyes still heavy but aware, following the soft movement of people around him. Grace sat on the edge of the bed, whispering to him between sips of orange juice. "You missed a lot," she said. "Your dad's hair got all gray, and Maria makes the best pancakes now. But don't worry," she says, "if you ask nicely, she'll make extra for you." Thomas stood by the doorway, watching them. The sound of Grace's chatter filled the room like music, the kind of sound Ethan's life had missed for far too long. "Dad," Ethan said suddenly, his voice fragile but steady enough to break Thomas's heart all over again. Thomas hurried to his side. "I'm here, son." Ethan looked at him, eyes glassy but alive. "Did it rain?" Thomas blinked, taken aback by the question. Then he smiled through tears. "Yes," he said softly. "It rained." And after that, the light came back. Ethan tried to smile. "Good." His fingers brushed against the lavender by the bed. "Smells like Mom." The words hit Thomas like sunlight through stained glass, painful and beautiful all at once. He placed his hand gently over his son's. "Yes, she'd be so proud of you." Grace leaned closer. "She helped too, you know," she whispered to Ethan. "Everyone who loves you did." Ethan looked at her for a long time, as if trying to remember a dream. "You're the girl," he said slowly. Grace smiled. "Yep, the one who made a mess with mud." He gave a small, tired laugh. The first true laugh in 12 years. "I liked the mud." Thomas laughed softly, too, unable to stop the tears from falling again. Maria entered quietly with a tray of soup and set it down. She glanced at Ethan, her eyes shining. "You'll need your strength, Joven. The world's been waiting for you." Ethan smiled faintly. The world can wait a bit longer. As the hours passed, the light shifted afternoon turning to evening, gold fading into amber. Grace and Maria dozed on the couch nearby while Thomas sat beside his son, holding his hand. The silence was peaceful now, no longer heavy, just quiet. Ethan's gaze drifted toward the window, where the sky was deepening into the soft blue of twilight. "Dad?" "Yes, son." "Oh, why? Are you crying?" Thomas smiled through the tears that still came too easily. "Because I almost forgot what joy felt like." Ethan blinked slowly. "You shouldn't forget. It's warm." Thomas let out a broken laugh, his hand tightening over his son's. "You sound like Grace." "Grace is smart," Ethan murmured, already fading into sleep. Thomas brushed his hair back gently. "She really is." He stayed there long after Ethan fell asleep, watching his son's chest rise and fall. Each breath was a miracle, not loud, not dramatic, but real. When the sun finally sank behind the horizon, Grace stirred. "Is he okay?" she whispered. Thomas nodded. "He's resting." "You did it, Grace. You really did." She smiled, her eyelids heavy. "I didn't do it alone." He looked at her, puzzled. "What do you mean?" Grace yawned. "She helped me. The lady in the garden. The one with the blue scarf. She said the light always finds a way back, if someone keeps it alive." Thomas's heart stopped for a beat. "Grace." "What lady?" "The one who hums like Maria," she murmured, already drifting back to sleep. "She said her name was Elena." Thomas froze. Elena. His late wife's name. He turned toward the window, where the last light of sunset painted the glass gold. A breeze drifted through the room, carrying the scent of lavender and rain. For a moment, he thought he heard it, a familiar hum, soft and distant, weaving through the air like a lullaby. He closed his eyes, letting the tears fall freely now. "Thank you," he whispered. The fireflies began to flicker in the garden again, tiny lanterns dancing above the soil that Grace had once called happy. Down the hallway, a door creaked softly. Ethan's door, but this time, it wasn't eerie or uncertain. It was gentle, like a heartbeat, a rhythm of life. Maria entered quietly, standing beside him. "He's strong," she said. "You both are." Thomas smiled faintly. "No," he said, shaking his head. "We just finally learned to listen." Maria looked at him curiously. "Listen to what?" He turned toward her, eyes soft, voice steady. "To what love sounds like when it never gives up." The house, once haunted by silence, now breathed with warmth. Outside, the night glowed with the quiet shimmer of fireflies. Inside, a father held his son's hand. A little girl dreamed peacefully beside them. And somewhere in that gentle space between night and dawn, a woman's voice remembered or imagined, whispered softly through the lavender-scented air. "You found the light, Thomas. Now keep it." From somewhere down the hallway came the soft sound of a door creaking open, Ethan's door. Only this time, it stayed open, and the light never went out again. There are stories that end not with grand gestures, but with quiet mornings, the kind where sunlight filters through old curtains, and forgiveness sits at the table like an old friend who never left. In that house, once filled with echoes and loss, laughter began to live again. Thomas no longer spoke to a silence. He spoke to life. And Ethan, eyes open to the world, taught everyone that love has a longer memory than pain. Grace, small, ordinary, radiant, reminded them that miracles rarely arrive wearing wings. Sometimes they just walk in carrying a tin bucket and a kind heart. Perhaps that's what redemption really is, not undoing the past, but daring to love in spite of it. The greatest wealth in life isn't written in bank ledgers or sealed behind hospital doors. It's found in the simple act of staying when it would have been easier to walk away. Love, when offered freely, can reach even the places science gives up on. Like a porch light left on through a long winter night, it waits patiently for those who have lost their way home. In every town across America, there's a kitchen where someone still sets an extra plate, just in case, or an old hand reaching to brush a child's hair the way they once did long ago. It's in those ordinary gestures, a word, a touch, a bit of grace, that life redeems itself. Because no matter how much time has passed, every heart deserves a second chance to be heard, to forgive, to begin again. So tonight, as you sit by your own window, maybe with the hum of a radio or the smell of coffee drifting through your home, take a moment to remember, the light we keep burning for others is the one that will guide us too. If this story touched something in you, leave a 1-inch the comments to let us know it found its way home. And if it didn't, or if you have thoughts to share, press 0 and tell us how we can do better. And may we all, in our own small ways, keep the light alive for the ones we love, for the ones we've lost, and for the parts of ourselves still waiting to be found.